I have a problem. Let me show you. This is my new studio. It's a pretty standard studio. It's about 15.5 feet by 12 feet. It's a good size. I just have too much stuff. I need to fit a desk, a studio table, a flat file, some shelving, some 3D printer shelving, and a bunch of other random odds and ends that will fill all the different corners. And I need to do it without it being an absolute wreck. No matter how I put this together, it just doesn't feel right. It's just jam-packed full of stuff, and the space doesn't feel super functional. I've done this every which way. It just doesn't work. So I am going to build a loft. And the purpose of this loft is I'm going to be able to take my flat file and some other random odds and ends storage and put it underneath this loft. And so now I have less things to put in the space. I can put my desk here with the chair. I can put my 3D printers here. I can put some shelving here. And then my studio table, which is on wheels, if I need to move it, it's free to do so. And there's just enough room for it to fit. So let's build a loft. I should mention that I'm not a woodworker. I'm not a carpenter. So if anything about this looks wrong or I'm doing it in not a great way, let me know in the comments because I'm making it up as I go. That said, there are 3 constraints for the loft. First, it needs to hold my body weight and some things that I will put up on top of it. Second, it needs to come apart very easily so that I can disassemble it when I move out of my current studio. And third, it needs to be affordable. So let's build a loft. So I measured the car, so the wood should fit, but it is a tiny Prius, so we'll see if it actually fits. Let's talk materials real quick. This entire construction is going to be made using just number 9 3-inch screws. I got 2 1-pound boxes of those, and 16 8-foot 2x4s. And I went with 8-foot 2x4s so that I could fit them into this tiny little car that you see here. And I don't need a top, and you'll see why in a little bit. Also, shout out to the guy in the background doing the exact same thing as I am right now. Barely. So I went with the construction that only uses screws so that it would meet that one criteria of easy to disassemble. And I decided on 3-inch screws because of the thickness of the 2x4s that I'm using so that nothing would ever show through, but they're going through as much wood as possible to add as much strength as possible when using the screws. Let's talk design. So these are some of my initial drawings, and a couple things I want to point out that you'll see as we get further in here. This is the rough side view. So we're going to make 3 vertical supports. We're going to build a top, and that's it. The vertical supports are all the exact same. I will show you a clearer drawing here in a second.
Not this time. It's totally made up. Pure fiction.
But you'll see that it consists of 2 2x4s. And one is 3.5 inches shorter than the other, which is the thickness of a 2x4. And that's so that a 2x4 can slot into there a little bit later. So this is the leg design, and there will be 2 of those on either side. And then we need some sort of cross beam to create some lateral support for the whole structure. And I went ahead and ended up doing something that looks a little bit like this, where I have sunk in a 2x4 into these leg constructions just so that it's a little bit less thick, because otherwise it would stick out and this whole construction would be 3.5 plus 1.5, and instead it's just under 4 inches when I've sunken it in, which is just a little bit nicer for space reasons. And then the top is pretty simple. It's just 48 inches wide with 4 studs across, so that's about 12 inches on center roughly. And I have these long pieces cut to 93 inches, and that cut is so that when you add the 1.5 inches for each of the end studs, that this whole construction ends up being 8 foot long, and a 4 foot by 8 foot piece of plywood, which will be making the top, as you'll see, fits on here perfectly without any gaps or anything. And then one last detail I want to point out, you'll see as I get to building, this top horizontal 2x4 is set to be on the exact same height as this 37-inch stud. And that's so that these cross beams have something to rest on, and it just adds a little bit more structural support across the entire construction. The leg construction is actually really straightforward. Each of the 3 legs consists of 6 pieces of wood, but only 3 measurements. So across all 3 legs, that's 18 cut studs. And with so few measurements, I got a lot of use out of the end stops on the chop saw. And if you're watching this for more specific ideas and measurements, again, remember, I'm not a professional, so your mileage may vary. But for each leg, that's 2 37-inch pieces, 2 40.5-inch pieces, and 2 48-inch pieces. And those 48-inch pieces are the cross beams. Cutting the indentations was a little bit more complicated. I asked the shop manager for some advice on how to cut them out. Thank you, Chase. We considered a dado and a couple other ideas, but ultimately he suggested just cutting the depth of the indentation on each end with the table saw, and then going in with the bandsaw to cut out the bulk of material. And here's a video of me pretending to do that because I definitely didn't forget to film any bandsaw. But I should also mention I did cut the legs after screwing the 2 2x4s together. I was just careful to avoid the screws holding it all together. That just made it a little bit easier, less cuts, less time on the table saw. And then this is where I encountered one of the first small issues of the build so far. Not all of the 2x4s were fitting into those indentations that I was making. So I did have a little bit of some fiddly extra work on the table saw to bring some of those indentations to the right dimension. From there though, things came together pretty easily. I'm putting 2 screws in most connections for some added strength, and I'm basically just measuring it as I go here so that I don't accidentally make any trapezoids. Okay, welcome to the studio for real. I should mention, I did this in kind of a weird order so that I could do all the cutting in the woodshop and just do assembly in my studio. I figured that was cleaner, but it also just meant less moving parts around, moving tools around, and that sort of thing. So there are a few pieces I should have trimmed after I brought them in here, but I kind of just made it work instead. I'm doing a bit of a test layout right here, and I'm starting to encounter one of the first small problems that came in the assembly process. And you can see in the corner here, there's this heater HVAC thing that I completely forgot about. And when I actually originally did the drawings and the mock-up of this, I had planned on making a slightly different leg for the end so that it could be butt up against the wall. And somewhere along the way, because it's taken me several weeks to actually come around and do this project, I just completely forgot about it. That's not a huge deal though. I'll just have like a little gap that I'll fill with some random stuff back there. But anyways, on to framing the top of the loft. And I basically just built this from the outside in. This is probably not the right way to do it, but it worked. And so that's what we're going with. That second interior stud gave me a little bit of a hard time. It was a little bit oversized. This is one of the pieces that I should have trimmed down, but I kind of just hammered it into place. And everything feels really firm, really sturdy, so we're rolling with it. So I ended up having to do this in kind of a weird order because the flat file is just so ridiculously heavy. I didn't want to have to move it into position once the loft was assembled and locked into the wall and all of that. So I went and grabbed my flat file. You can see I'm getting it in position. I have sort of a very precise location that I need it to be so that it's right butt up against the right-hand side of the loft so that there's as much room as possible for storage on the other side. And this thing's super heavy. It's really not a one-person move job. And you can see the way I'm moving it by standing in the middle of it. That's exactly why I wanted to move this before I got the loft all in place. It would have been completely impossible to do if I tried to do it after the loft was assembled. So from here, we're finally making some progress. And just as I'm getting close to finishing up this assembly, I encounter the next problem. So I didn't have this in my drawings. So I need to put another offcut 2x4 in this gap here. And this mistake I can't really blame anyone for. This one's really just a lack of thorough planning and thorough drawing out of the space. In my original drawing, I measured for outlets, I measured and planned for pretty much everything. And up until now, all of my mistakes have been I planned for it and then I forgot that I had planned for it. But in this case, I just completely didn't even label or mark out that pull chain for the blinds was right there. So I'm having to work around that now that I'm in the space, unfortunately. It kind of worked out really nicely though, because in the end, I basically put some offcuts onto the wall to create a little bit of a gap in the corner there. And that works great because now I have a place to run power cables to the outlet that is back behind the loft that I'm blocking. So kind of a happy accident, I'd say. This thing is so ridiculously overbuilt that I think this is maybe unnecessary, but I did also screw the loft into both the left and the right side wall for some extra stability and also just to hold it in the corner where I want it to stay. I don't want it to wobble or anything. The flat file also is jammed right in between two of the supporting legs, and that also has a little bit of some support going into the whole structure, preventing it from like toppling over to one side, which is good because I'm going to be standing and sitting on top of this thing, and I don't really want it to collapse with me on top of it. Okay, we are finally going to put the top onto the loft. And the reason that I didn't need to buy a top is because I actually already had a 4x8 cut of 3/4 inch plywood that years ago I got for free, and I have since routed the corners round and given it 2 coats of polyurethane. So it's a really nice surface, and I'm actually going to just be using that as my floor. Unfortunately, that also brings us to the next mistake that I made. Oh, how did I not think of that? Oh, right, I was meant to cut my long pieces down. Well, I'm not redoing it now. Yeah, there's like a little gap here that was not meant to be there.
I have these long pieces cut to 93 inches.
Yeah, so in my excitement to just get out of the wood shop and get into my studio, I just never cut 3 inches off of all of my long pieces. So, whoopsie. I'm going to try and look at the glass half full here though, because it kind of works great as a little bit of like a handle for climbing up onto the loft. So, not a total failure? Anyways, all that was left with the actual assembly of the loft was to put some screws through the top into the framing. And now that that's done, you can enjoy a little bit of my first time climbing up onto it. I made this. That's so sick. This is bringing me a lot of joy. It's not going anywhere. Cool. Beefy. It's beautiful. Fuck yeah. Okay, some finishing touches before we get to hauling all of my things into the studio. First, we need to get the flat file drawers in here, and it only took me 7 out of 10 drawers to get smart and just move them all at once on one of my dollies. Be honest. Did that look cool?
No.
So I want to put a little lip on the front of the thing here just to prevent the desk from falling off of the top. But from there, Let's get some of the bigger furniture actually into the studio. I can't believe the printer didn't fall. It's almost more unbelievable that I tried to do it again, but thankfully I don't mess it up the second time. So all I need to do now to finish off the studio is get a boatload of odds and ends actually into the space. So I will catch back up with y'all when that's all completely done. I freaking love this thing. I feel like a total child on it, but it's so good. It was totally worth it. It freed up so much space in my studio. I feel like this is the first time since I've been in grad school that I actually have a functional studio, which is so nice.
Look at me, I'm a grad student. I'm 30 years old and I made $600 last year.
Bernard, don't make fun of grad students. They just made a terrible life choice.
And I really have to say it's all thanks to this totally overbuilt, super extra loft that I made. And yeah, it's not perfect. I screwed up a couple times, but I love it. So as far as cost, if that's the sort of thing that interests you, I spent about $75 at Lowe's the other day, getting the 2x4s and the 2 boxes of screws. And this 3/4 inch piece of plywood is probably like $700 right now. But thankfully I've had this for a couple years, so I didn't have to pay for that part. But that's all I got. If subscribing is your bag, please consider subscribing. But either way, I hope to see you again sometime soon on the internet.